Come on, guys, it's Fantasy Stock Exchange here, and today we're going to bring you a new series to the channel that we're going to coin as Dynasty 101, where we're basically going to be taking, macro ideas, big market ideas, and kind of show you guys how to manage a Dynasty team and really several different Dynasty concepts that you can apply to your Dynasty football management. But today we're going to be breaking down how myself and Corey exacted rebuilds in two of our leagues and kind of show you guys exactly what type of moves you could be looking to when you're ready to take on a rebuild. But before we get into anything today, Corey, how you doing?
I'm doing good. And yeah, as Danny mentioned, this video is basically how to rebuild a dynasty team. You guys hear us talk about it all the time. You hear us talk about it on Dynasty Decisions. Maybe you should move towards a rebuild, etc. We're going to show you two rebuilds that we have both done recently. And for me, it was like in the last week and a half. So very, very recently. We're going to go through all the moves that we made, some of the mindset, that we had at certain points that led us to rebuilding. All that stuff will be covered in today's video. And as Danny mentioned, this is a new series that Danny is running. I am just on the first episode, basically. And he's going to be bringing on guests around the industry that you guys probably know. And we're going to be talking about, or he's going to be talking about macro game theory ideas with these guests to get some other opinions around here. But since I recently started a rebuild, we figured we'd do this one together, talking about how exactly to rebuild in Dynasty Fantasy Football.
For sure. And you mentioned you started a rebuild, I started a rebuild. It's going to be fun kind of outlining the deals, outlining the thought that we had when we exacted these deals, and overall how our teams have kind of changed in terms of dynamic after making these deals. But before we get into the trades and before we get into the teams, as always, we're going to hit the intro. All right, so Corey, I'll let you kind of take it away with what your team kind of started as and what you were looking to do with the team once you were able to identify that you wanted to exact the rebuild.
Right, for sure. So this is the team I had. You guys will be able to see it on the screen right now. The starters are in bold. So you can see I had Herbert, Stafford as my top two quarterbacks. Didn't have a notable QB3. Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Justin Jefferson, Mike Williams, Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen, Dawson Knox of note. Didn't have my first round pick in 2022. The first thing that you'll notice, just like we do with Dynasty Decisions, the first thing that we're going to evaluate and see what the next steps are. So I had a couple options, right? I finished in third place this season, got bounced round one. The first thing that I noticed when I took over this team, because I actually inherited it as a orphan mid-season, I was 6-2 when I got the team. The first thing that I noticed when I took over this team is that the team is shallow, right? It has very good starters. When you look at the starting lineup, it's, rivals any team that you're going to see in a redraft or dynasty format. But the problem was I didn't have a lot of depth, and I didn't have a lot of draft capital as well because I didn't have my first round pick to kind of supplement that depth. Also, I didn't win, and now I have a decision to make. I figured, I took over this team. It's 6-2. I'm going to try and win this year and reevaluate in the 2022 offseason. And I didn't win, so now I had a decision to make. As we've talked about on numerous occasions, you need to take a good hard look in the mirror and determine, can my team compete or can my team not compete? Now, is there a world where this team can compete this year? Absolutely, right? But I'm not comfortable going into a season knowing that if one thing goes wrong, if Dalvin Cook gets suspended because he does have a pending legal situation, if Alvin Kamara gets suspended because he has a pending legal situation, then all of a sudden my team goes from a top 4 team in the league to a middle of the pack team. And middle of the pack is never where you want to be. I took a good, long, hard look in the mirror and determined that this team needs to be rebuilt while these premier assets that I have, like Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, etc., still have a lot of value. And that goes back to what I talked about last week in the Sell These Running Backs Now video. If you guys want to check it out, it's, recently posted on the channel. I made the decision to rebuild this team preemptively because most people would have went in one more year and tried to win again.
Yeah, no, and I fully agree. Sometimes in Dynasty, you have to make these hard decisions. You have to objectively look at your team and say, can I see myself competing for the first, the second, or at the bare minimum, the third seed? If you can't see yourself doing that, then you should rebuild. And when I say first, second, or third seed, I don't mean like you're the third seed in a 2-horse race. I mean like you have the tools to arguably be the top team in your league. If you can't say that with a straight face, then it's time to rebuild. And you're able to see, I mean, you have some premier assets on the team. You have some premier top-end fantasy players, but you realize and you've thought out, I don't have the depth. I don't have the sufficient depth to be able to compete at the highest level. So as a result, I mean, you'll see some of the moves that Corey made, and then especially when we transition to my team as well. We made some big time moves to increase the liquidity, to increase the appreciating asset real ability of these teams. So I'll let you take it away with some of the deals you made.
Right. And the first concept that we're going to talk about, because this is more of a macro based,
Yes.
theory video, the first concept that we're going to talk about is that when you are rebuilding a team, you need to make trades that make your future better. So, on face value, if this is a competitive team versus a competitive team, maybe you're losing some of these trades, right? But we're not rebuilding our team to win trades. We're rebuilding our team to make our team better in the long term. So, some of these trades you might not agree with. You might be like, hey, you didn't win that trade. You gave up too much value for that player. But in the long run, if it made my team better, then it's a worthwhile trade. So, let's get into the first one. I made this trade about a week and a half ago, right before Deshaun Watson's deposition in front of the grand jury. And I wanted I didn't have any shares of Deshaun Watson. I knew Deshaun Watson would be back on the field either this year after a suspension or whatever the case is. I knew he wasn't going away. And he's been out of sight, out of mind for so long, to the point that I wanted to get a share of Deshaun Watson before the price has gone up. And the price has gone up because now we know in, probably hours, we're going to get a decision on when he's actually going to be traded. I traded away Dalvin Cook and the 206 in the rookie draft for Deshaun Watson. And this is a super flex league. This is a tight end premium league. So the 206 is still a pretty decent player. It's probably like a middle tier wide receiver or something like that. I made this trade because the second Deshaun Watson was acquitted, right after as we already know, he wasn't fined with anything criminal. Deshaun Watson's value hopped from, a fourth, fifth round startup pick to a first, second round startup pick. And I wanted to take advantage of that window. Even if I wasn't fully invested in the rebuild quite yet, I thought this was a good buying window for Deshaun Watson, and it increases my longevity, getting myself a third quarterback at the time because I had Justin Herbert and Matthew Stafford, who has the ceiling to be a top, 3 quarterback in fantasy and is still very young.
I fully agree with you here. This is the perfect type of deal you can make if you're trying to get appreciating level assets. Obviously, now if you tried to trade for Deshaun Watson, you wouldn't get this level of price tag, but being able to absorb risk and being able to identify when a player's value is at their low point, it's how you can capitalize on an inefficient market. You capitalized on Deshaun Watson, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of question marks. People didn't necessarily know the status of his legal situation, and you went out and acquired what is now consensus a top 8 quarterback asset at minimum. He's my quarterback 6. You were able to acquire for a running back that's already reached the age and touch apex that you outlined in that video, and parted with what, a fringe wide receiver 4 type for one of the top 10 or 12 assets in Dynasty fantasy football. Now, this is an excellent trade, and right now, if you were to have to rebuild this trade or remake this trade, if you were to part with Dalvin Cook and 2 1s, I don't even think that gets it done.
Yeah, I mean, like, it depends on your league format. If you have a more
Of
redraft
course.
style league, maybe people hold Dalvin Cook in high regard. But ask anybody out there right now trying to sell Dalvin Cook in a dynasty format right now to try and rebuild their team. It's not easy. People don't want to invest in Dalvin Cook because of the injuries, because of the age, all that stuff. You're going to have to invest in an uncertain asset like Deshaun Watson if you want to get something done for a guy like Dalvin Cook. So that was the first trade that kind of kickstarted my rebuild. Now that I knew I'm not competing next year because I don't have, my RB1 or my RB2, depending on what you think of Kamara, I need to start selling my other contending pieces and go for a more rebuilding style approach. So the same guy that I sold Deshaun Watson, or I got Deshaun Watson from, I told him, hey, you're in a competing window now because you have Dalvin Cook. So do you want Alvin Kamara as well? Because Alvin Kamara was also on my team. He's a win now type of running back. So he offered me his 2023 first and the 304 for Alvin Kamara. Now, on surface level, a lot of people, I put polls for every single one of these trades out on Twitter. This was the one that people thought I lost the hardest of all the trades that I'm going to talk about. And at face value, if you're a contender, are you okay giving up a 2023 first if you expect it to be mid to late and the 304? Sure. But does this make my team better as the rebuilding team? Absolutely. And speaking quickly on this guy's team, he's also in a similar situation as where I was at before I made these trades. His team, his starting roster is very good, but if he has a couple injuries, that 2023 first could become a better pick.
For sure. And the way I kind of view this trade, and we were talking about it off camera, we were talking about it before we recorded, is that you're making the majority of these deals now. Are they probably market value relatively fair based off what we project these players to be? Yeah, sure. But the downside risk of holding on to those aging assets, talking about the running back assets, talking about the older wide receivers that you had, and we'll get into them later. If you consider the downside risk in that situation, then it's clear to me in your position, getting liquidity, getting appreciating assets for pieces that really are going to inhibit your ultimate rebuild in the long run in general is a fantastic move. And again, people are going to see 2023 first and 304 for Alvin Kamara. This was a guy that was, a first round startup pick a couple years ago. He's getting up there in the age apex. He's getting up there in terms of his value diminishing at a faster rate, and getting a 2023 first and getting, a 3 or 4, you can get, a Tyler Algier there. You can get maybe, a John Mechie there. There are some options at that 3 or 4 as well. And that 2023 first, I'm telling you, a year's time, if you were to say you were going to ask for a 2023 first for Alvin Kamara, you would get laughed at.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense because the one certainty that we have in Dynasty, especially with the running back position, is that people will overvalue age, right? So the older a player gets, the less valuable he's going to be. I'm doing behind the scenes a part 2 version of the Sell These Running Backs Now video that I put out a week ago or so. And I looked specifically at running backs who had finished as multi-time RB1s. So the elite guys. I'm not talking about, bums. I'm talking about Matt Fortes and Adrian Peterson's, guys that mattered for fantasy because Alvin Kamara and Dalvin Cook have both finished as RB1s multiple times. These guys, the one certainty and the one constant was that they lost Dynasty ADP among running backs as soon as they started to fall off. And they lost a lot of Dynasty ADP among other running backs, about 20 spots on average for all of those guys combined. And I'll cover that in the coming days. I'll put out a big video about that. But the third trade, it's the same guy. So unfortunately for me, I'm trading with the same guy here, and this makes his team better, which ergo makes my pick worse because I'm giving him better assets for this season. But like I said, if I showed you this guy's team, and maybe I'll pull it up and throw it up on the screen right now, this guy has a very shallow team similar to what I had. So if he loses a couple pieces here and there for injuries, this pick could still become, a mid first or whatever the case is. But regardless, I think this was my favorite trade that I made because I think this was the one that benefited my team the most. And that was Stephon Diggs and Keenan Allen, who are two, aging receivers on my team who are still going to be productive. No worries about their, age apex or anything because they're wide receivers, not running backs. But the 105, the 109, 205, and a 2023 mid to late second, to me, was a good enough price to move off of these guys because I can replace Stephon Diggs and Keenan Allen in this year's draft at 105 with Drake London, who I assume will be there. And if he's not, I'll just take Garrett Wilson or Treylon Burks. 109, I could get a Chris Olave. I could get, maybe a quarterback, Sam Howell or Matt Corral or something like that as my quarterback 3 for my rebuild. At 205, I'm still going to get a solid wide receiver prospect at that point in time as well. And in next year's second rounder, I have a bunch of second rounders in this league now that I'm stacking up so that I can, use those as trade chips as well. So I think this trade was the most beneficial to my team by far because it allowed me to replenish my depth.
Yeah, and I fully agree here. I mean, if you're looking at the 105 and 109 in particular, like let's just name names. I know this is a more macro video, but if we were to micro analyze these type of picks in terms of what players they can represent, let's just say 105, you mentioned Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Treylon Burks. At minimum, right off the bat when they're drafted, they are going to be in the same area of our dynasty ranks as Stephon Diggs. So I genuinely think that in your position, 105 for Diggs is probably comparable already. And then when we're talking about Keenan Allen, you mentioned 109, Jameson Williams, Chris Olave, a receiver like that. Maybe he won't be at Keenan Allen's level on face value, but for the context of your team, you're moving a 29-year-old receiver for a 21, 22-year-old type of talent that you can have when you're ready to compete, when you're ready to enter into your competing window. On top of that, the 205 in the second, 205, you're talking about guys like Pickens, Sky Moore, Justin Ross, and then obviously that 2023 second. If you guys have done any research, you would know how fantastic that class is projected to be. So in your situation, again, face value, somebody might look at this. Oh, Stephon Diggs was a top 5 receiver. Keenan Allen's been a top 5 receiver. Yes, on face value for a contender, they are really good pieces. But from your position as a rebuilder, you're liquidizing these assets, you're pushing them into a future, and you're making sure that the assets you're getting back can't lose value. It's like investing in a house. You're trading basically 2 Ferraris for a mansion right here. So I absolutely love what you're able to do in acquiring this deal.
Right. And the other underrated thing about this is that I'm tanking my own pick with this too, because I still have my 2023 first. And if I'm moving off all this elite production at wide receiver that Diggs and Keenan Allen will presumably give me next year, I'm getting myself closer to Bijan Robinson, closer to Bryce Young, closer to CJ Stroud and Jahmyr Gibbs and Jackson Smith and Jigba and all these guys that we know are expected to be great prospects next year. So that is another side benefit of making this trade, is that I tank my own pick, because the way my team is already set up now, I have no Alvin Kamara. I have no Dalvin Cook. My best running back at the time of this trade was James Conner, and he was the only relevant running back that I had on my team. So my running back core is going to need to be replenished through the 2022 and 2023 draft classes, which is what you probably should be doing if you're going to aim to rebuild your team. Look to get your running backs as the last thing that you get, and probably in the rookie drafts when they're probably going to go for the cheapest amount. Because if you had completed a rebuild last year, and let's say you had the 103 and you took Najee Harris, or the 102 and you took Najee Harris, and you took Javonte Williams with the 107, suddenly you have 2 top 5 dynasty running backs to spearhead your team.
Yep, I fully agree. Love the deal that you're able to make here. I'll let you take it away with how free agency was actually able to impact this next deal for you and ultimately get a deal done that benefits your team for the future.
Yeah, so when James Conner re-signed with the Cardinals, which I think honestly was the best case scenario for James Conner, because we've seen him be productive in the system already. We know how they're going to use him. We know what his role is going to be. After James Conner re-signed with the Arizona Cardinals, I knew this was my selling window, right? Because if I was a contender, I would want to be buying James Conner if the person is going to sell him for a decent price. So I know as a rebuilder, people are going to be thinking the same thing. So I traded away Matthew Stafford, who I've been wanting to move for a couple days now, because he's my second quarterback, or my third quarterback behind Watson and Justin Herbert, but he's also up there in age. He's in his prime. A contender is going to need Matthew Stafford if they need elite quarterback production this season. I traded away Matthew Stafford, James Conner, and a 2023 third. And in exchange for that, I got Hollywood Brown, who we both believe is just a phenomenal buy low candidate right now, and a 2023 first. And this guy's team is actually even in worse shape than the other guys that I was trading to. So I actually expect this first to be somewhere in the middle of the round. I don't think it's going to be a late first rounder, but even if it is a mid to late first rounder, I still think this is a solid deal. But this guy's first definitely has a chance to fall early if things break right for me. He has, a couple good pieces, but really even his starting lineup has holes, let alone his depth. So I really like this move for me. This was, again, one of my more, beneficial moves for my team. And I still have a number of guys that I can trade off of free agent news. Russell Gage being one of those guys, because he just got signed to Tampa Bay.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love this deal for you. If I were to contextualize this deal, I would say that for a contender, Stafford for the 2023 first is probably about appropriate value. And I would much rather, even at face value, Hollywood Brown to Connor in the third. I think Hollywood Brown is one of the more slept on dynasty receivers in general. Again, I know this is a more macro video, but from a micro standpoint, these are the type of players you want to look for. Guys that can command targets at a young age, that are kind of getting slept on by the community because they're automatically assuming something to be the case. The community is automatically assuming that Rashad Bateman's going to usurp Marquise Brown, which doesn't make sense to me. I love Rashad Bateman, but Marquise Brown
He
showed
has to
last year.
take the targets away from him physically. He's not
Correct.
going to be given anything. Marquise Brown, were we high on Marquise Brown coming into this year? Absolutely not. We didn't think he was any good, couldn't command targets. But when you command 145 targets in a season, that gets my attention.
Yes, fully. So overall, you can kind of explain how your team changed now and what type of assets that you were able to accumulate overall.
Right. So this is what my team looks like now. You guys should be able to see it on the screen. As you can see, I have a good framework for a rebuild. This, to me, if one of you guys sent this in for a dynasty decisions question, I would like this team a lot more than I would like the other team that I sent previously. Could I have contended this year again with Dalvin Cook and Kamara and all those guys? Probably. But like I said, I like this spot a lot more because I have a lot more roster flexibility, and I can still be competitive probably in 1 year's time if I'm able to hit on my picks. I have some foundational wide receivers, obviously Justin Jefferson being the biggest example, but I still have Marquise Brown and Mike Williams, and even some decent depth like Cedric Wilson and Russell Gage, who could turn into something that I can either trade or I can hold on to going into the future. And like I said, I could hit on a 105 pick of Drake London. I could hit on a 109 pick of Chris Olave or Matt Corral or Sam Howell to add as a third quarterback. I could grab an upside running back at 205 like Tyler Algier or Rachaad White, or I could grab, another wide receiver like David Bell or Christian Watson or Justin Ross or something like that. So I really like the position that I'm in with those third and fourth round picks. I'm probably just going to be looking for best player available. In the 2022 season, I'm going to tank my own pick in order to secure Bijan Robinson. That is my goal. If it's not Bijan Robinson, it'll be Jahmyr Gibbs or whatever running back I can secure. I am trying to tank my own pick this year, as well as hope that the other guys that I traded picks away to lose some games and have some injuries so that their picks could end up high for me as well, and use my first next year to replenish my running back core. And boom, I could be ready to compete as soon as 2023 with a much brighter future than what I was, tasked with early on.
Yep. So again, if you guys made it this far in the video, 20 minutes in the video, this is a very good way to be able to replenish youth on a team that you cite as seeing top heavy, that you don't necessarily see can compete in the long-term future. Like maybe they'd be good this year, but they don't have any long-term liquidity. This is how you're able to create liquidity. You take those old assets, you replace them with younger appreciating assets. Corey did a very good job with this rebuild, and I have a very similar situation in one of my home leagues. I was a team that drafted win now out of the startup last year. I picked Jonathan Taylor at the 103, had a very, very well constructed team, ended up finishing the regular season in first place. I ended up getting bounced in the first round of the playoffs due to some injuries really affecting my team. Go into the offseason. Tom Brady retires for me. Right when that happens, did I dwell on the situation? I say, oh, shoot, this really sucks. How am I going to compete next year? No. I took that as a sign and said, it's time to rebuild. In a more casual league, I know that the assets I have can net me a great return. And this first trade, people might see and say, well, you're giving up Jonathan Taylor. Like, why did you not get more? And on face value, maybe I could have gotten a little bit more, but for the context of my team, I was able to transition a good, really, really stout, really high regarded win now running back and get, in my opinion, a top 15 startup pick at quarterback and an elite top 6 or so dynasty wide receiver in Jalen Waddle. You guys can see the team or the trade on the screen, but I was able to acquire Dak Prescott and Jalen Waddle in exchange for Jonathan Taylor, AJ Dillon, Ryan Tannehill, 211, and what figures to be a mid to late second in 2024 by the time I'm able to replenish this team. Is this a fair deal? I think it's about a fair deal on face value. Maybe somebody might lean the contending side, but from my perspective, I'm very high on Jalen Waddle, and Dak Prescott already for me is close in terms of value of asset that I have for Jonathan Taylor as it is. So overall, I'm a very big fan of this deal, but I understand if you're watching this, you might think, oh, like you should have gotten the second. Why did you throw one in?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's if you added a second rounder to this trade, I think it is probably an even deal. I would take the contending side at face value, but like I said at the beginning of the video, this made your team better. This made your rebuild, accelerated. When you're rebuilding, the best thing you can have is elite assets. And like what I talked about with my own team, having Justin Herbert and Justin Jefferson makes it a lot easier to rebuild than not having those guys. And also Deshaun Watson, like I mentioned after the first trade. So having elite assets like what Dak Prescott and Jalen Waddle represent is a lot better for your outlook in the rebuild than, having Jonathan Taylor blow his, productivity in the first 2 to 3 seasons of his career. And then he's a declining asset by the time you're ready to compete.
Correct. So the way I kind of outlined it here is I ship these win now pieces. Obviously, running back position. I know Jonathan Taylor's young, but yes, he is still a running back. Therefore, he's a win now piece. And Ryan Tannehill, an older, limited type of quarterback, and get younger and much better at quarterback. So absolutely love this deal. Next trade I have here, I actually moved off Darren Waller and Mike Williams, and I ended up receiving DJ Moore in the 301. And for me, the way I analyze this move is Darren Waller an elite tight end? Yes. But again, he's an older tight end, and he would indicate that my team is in win now. So I moved that and Mike Williams, and I end up getting a young, talented wide receiver that I have in my top 12 of my dynasty rankings and the 301, which, we mentioned guys like Justin Ross might fall there, especially in a casual league. I am confident that I can get a good young asset at that pick.
Yeah, again, this is another trade where if you look at this at face value, I'd probably take the contending side. But Mike Williams, despite his new contract, and I'm assuming you made this before he actually signed his new contract, because I think his value has gone up since then, that he re-signed and is still attached to Justin Herbert. But even still, DJ Moore is, ranked pretty comfortably ahead of Mike Williams for me. You secure an elite asset going forward. Maybe even DJ Moore gets a quarterback upgrade and you sell him for more draft capital in the next coming days. If Deshaun Watson goes to the Carolina Panthers, you're not, married to DJ Moore to hold him to your team. You can always just move him once he finally gets that quarterback upgrade.
Yep, for sure. So I get the youth, the pick, move off the elite or the older assets. So we'll get into the third deal, which you guys can see here. This is when I really found the opportunity to fully embrace the rebuild. I traded away, last year's RB2 with Austin Eckler, George Kittle, an elite tight end, DeAndre Hopkins, and Matt Ryan. for a boatload of young picks. 102, a 2023 first, I expect to be mid to late, a 2024 first, Aaron Jones, and 2024 third. I didn't really care about getting Aaron Jones here, but I'm like, okay, I may as well get something else here. He didn't have any other picks because we can't trade into 2025. So I'm like, you know what? I can just take on Aaron Jones and end up flipping him later, as you guys will see. So to me here, that 102 right off the bat, I'm looking at Breece Hall or Malik Willis. He's already worth at least, we'll say what, Austin Eckler and DeAndre Hopkins. And then when you package in those other picks for the other assets, this is the type of move you have to be making if you're ready to fully embrace a rebuild.
Right. And in an ideal world, you don't want to sell a bunch of pieces at once like Danny did in this trade. But sometimes that is the best way to do it because one person might look at your team and be like, hey, my team is only a couple pieces away. I'm willing to mortgage my future to win a championship, which is what I did when I made the 3 trades with the same person in my example. And then what Danny did selling a bunch of assets here because again, I actually made a trade last year in a different league where I sold Tom Brady, Deebo Samuel, Ronald Jones, Devin Singletary, and somebody else. So a bunch of pieces in one trade. And I got, 3 first-round picks and 2 second-rounders and 2 young pieces or a couple young pieces. So sometimes these trades are actually the smart move to make because one person, all it takes is one person to convince themselves that they're, a couple pieces away from contending and they'll give up their future for you.
This is the perfect example of what we've been mentioning in Dynasty decisions for the longest time in terms of liquidating your assets when they are at peak value. You mentioned, who knows? What if Austin Eckler gets hurt this year? His running back value goes down tremendously given the age.
Even if Austin Eckler finishes as a top 3 running back again, he will go down in value because he's an aging running back. That is just a stone cold fact. If Austin Eckler goes out again, has the exact same season that he had last year, he will still be cheaper than he is now.
Yep, for sure. So we can move on to the next deal. And I mentioned I picked up Aaron Jones in the last deal. He's not staying on my team for long. 27-year-old running back, free agent next year, nearing that touch and age apex. I want to be able to replenish that in terms of what I view as more value long term. I was able to buy low on Calvin Ridley. Yes, I am saying buy low. Whenever you can get a player with elite level ceiling in fantasy at a low, ridiculous cost, you go and do it. And for a contender who's going to be without Calvin Ridley this year, this is really the only time I could have been able to poach Calvin Ridley off of him. So I was able to move Aaron Jones in the 306 this year and end up receiving Calvin Ridley and Hunter Henry in what is a 2x tight end premium.
Yeah, I think this trade makes a lot of sense overall. When you look at Calvin Ridley and Hunter Henry, 2 assets. I mean, Hunter Henry's probably at a pretty high point in his value, but Calvin Ridley, is it going to get cheaper than Calvin Ridley is right now? If Calvin Ridley comes back in the NFL in 2023 for the season and he signs a new contract to a new team and he's back to the same old Calvin Ridley, you're going to be able to sell him for a whole lot more than that, if not just use him on your team. He'll still only be, 28, 29 years old at that point. So at wide receiver, that's not, a handicap or anything. So let's get into trade number 4 here.
Yeah, trade number 4 here is, obviously the main news of the past week and a half or so. Brady unretires. Brady unretires after I already started my rebuild. Did I panic? Did I try to say, oh, you know what? I got Brady back. Let me recoup assets. Let me try to win again now. No, I use this as leverage because I had Mike Evans. I had Tom Brady. Both of their inherent values increased with that news. So instead of panicking, I traded him along with Mike Evans and Amari Cooper and ended up being able to get the 104, the 201, and Kadarius Toney. For a win now team, obviously getting Tom Brady, Mike Evans, and Amari Cooper really helps your cause at pushing for the championship. The one who made this move won the championship last year, trying to go back to back. So it's fair on his end already. On my end, I'm able to move an aging asset. You're talking about a 44-year-old quarterback, a win now receiver, and another win now receiver, and ended up getting a lot of youth to really replenish my team for when I'm willing to compete in the 2023-2024 timeframe.
Right, and Cooper had already been traded by the time of this trade as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
correct.
So when you break this trade down, it's pretty easy to me. I'd rather have the 104 than Mike Evans. I'd rather have the 201 than Tom Brady, and I'd rather have Kadarius Toney than Amari Cooper. That's pretty simple how I would break that down. Personally, maybe Kadarius Toney versus Amari Cooper is more of a discussion, but I do think this is a good trade for you. You get some good premium assets for that. Let's get into the final trade, and then we'll look at your team at the end of end of all these moves. But trade number 5.
Yeah, correct. And with trade number 5, I had no plans on trading Jalen Waddle. I view this guy in a super high regard, but somebody asked about their interest, and instead of balking, instead of saying, "Oh, I don't think you have the assets to be able to make a trade for Jalen Waddle," I heard him out. He said, "What do you want for Jalen Waddle?" I threw out, "Would you be willing to give Devontae Smith and that first round pick you have?" He said, "I'm willing to do that." So I was able to get Devontae Smith in the 108 for Jalen Waddle. As much as I'd rather prefer Jalen Waddle, I still have a very high view in terms of regard to what Devontae Smith can offer and getting the 108. You mentioned guys, Chris Olave. Maybe somebody falls because this league really likes good workhorse running backs. Maybe a Drake London falls to 108. Who knows? Either way, I'm looking at that as two good young wide receiver assets for the price of one. And in terms of a rebuild, replenishing that youth, replenishing that talent pool, replenishing that depth, I'm really a fan of this type of move.
Yeah, I will say, I think if this was Devontae Smith in the 106 and you could guarantee me virtually that you're going to get one of the top 3 receivers, I would like this move a lot more. Because if those guys are off the board and, Kenneth Walker, Isaiah Spiller off the board, and you got to stare down the barrel of, a quarterback, maybe with a subpar landing spot, or, Chris Olave or something, I think this trade probably favors the Jalen Waddle side. But, the odds indicate that you're either going to get a quarterback with that pick, or you're going to get, a better wide receiver than you thought that you were going to get initially at the 108. So I think this is a pretty solid move depending on who that 108 turns into.
For sure. So overall, you guys can see my team now: quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, and the picks I was able to accumulate. My next moves, as you guys can tell from this roster, is offloading my win now running back pieces. You're talking about Fournette, Sanders, and Ronald Jones once he signs in free agency, and increasing my liquidity, increasing my future assets. If I can package, Fournette and Sanders into a 2023 first for a contender, I can see that move being able to be made.
Yeah, again, back to the Waddle trade. The one thing I will say is that I might have kept Waddle, knowing that you had all the first that you had. Devontae Smith is good, but I've already seen the elite ceiling out of Jalen Waddle. He already has the elite value in Dynasty right now. So having an elite wide receiver asset probably was a little bit more appealing to me. Like I kind of talked about with my own team, having elite assets in a long-term rebuild is always very, very important. But other than that, I do think you've set yourself up well. At the 102, you can get a great player there. 104, obviously, you're still going to get either one of those top 3 receivers, Malik Willis or Breece Hall. And then at 108, you should, theoretically, somebody will probably fall to you, whether it's Sam Howell or, one of those top 3 receivers, or even if you have to take Kenneth Walker or Isaiah Spiller, you could probably trade them midseason for way more than you paid.
For sure. And again, like in most home leagues, especially in the half PPR format, I think I have a decent chance at maybe getting one of those top receivers. I think Isaiah Spiller, I think Kenneth Walker, as long as they get adequate draft capital and landing spot, should be able to be pushed up the board, because that's typically what happens in a lot of casual leagues. The wide receivers will fall because like a lot of casual players just have this mindset that running backs win championships. I need the running back over the receiver. And ultimately that may help me in terms of getting, as you mentioned, maybe not Burks because he's getting a lot of hype, but Drake London, Garrett Wilson may fall to me.
Yep, for sure. So if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, hit the like button, comment any of your thoughts down below, subscribe to the channel if you are new. Like I said, Danny will be running this series himself with guests. So if you have an idea for a guest that you guys want to see Danny and him chop it up about Dynasty macro ideas and game theory, by all means, leave it in the comment section down below. We don't have a lot of pull in this industry, but we should be able to get, a guest on that you guys want to see. So let him know down below if you guys want to see a specific guest. Like I said, Dynasty Rankings Manifesto is available on Patreon. You guys can check out the link in the description for that. We just updated it with our rookie rankings, top 36 for one quarterback and for Superflex. Without further ado, guys, peace out. We'll talk to you soon.